I took the ranger station assignment in the Appalachian backcountry because I thought I understood what being alone in the woods actually meant. And by my third season with the Forest Service, I had already spent enough nights in remote cabins and lookout shacks to stop romanticizing it. So when they sent me to a small station near the North Carolina-Tennessee line in late October, I expected the usual version of isolation. Long stretches of cold quiet, a few tired backpackers drifting through before dusk, radio check-ins with dispatch that came through clearer on some nights than others, and the constant background sound of the mountains settling into dark. But that station had something different about it from the first evening I arrived. Not because of the building itself, which was just a low wooden cabin with a screened porch, a radio room, a bunk, and a storage shed tucked beside a trail junction miles from the nearest service road, but because of how cut off it felt once the light went. As if the trees around it weren't just growing there, but leaning inward, listening. And the first thing that bothered me was a handwritten note pinned beneath the trail conditions board outside the door that said, "If you hear someone calling from the lower trace after dark, stay on the main path." And I remember staring at it with my pack still over one shoulder, trying to decide whether it was a joke left by some local who liked stirring up old mountain superstition, because there was no official route called the lower trace anymore. Only an abandoned footpath you could still make out on older maps. And almost nobody under 60 used that name. But the paper was clean, the handwriting steady, and the thumbtack holding it in place came from inside the station, which meant whoever left it had either found their way into the porch storage box, or had stood close enough to the cabin to help themselves without worrying about being seen. And that was enough to sour my mood before I had even unpacked. Though I still told myself there had to be an ordinary explanation, because there usually is, and the next day did its best to support that idea. With only a pair of section hikers asking about water levels, and one older couple stopping in to complain that someone had moved a rock ring at a legal campsite a mile east, which hardly counted as a wilderness emergency. But late that afternoon, just before sunset, a young guy named Owen came in alone carrying a nearly empty pack and asked whether another ranger had passed him on the trail. And when I told him no, he described seeing a man in a tan jacket standing just off the path near a rhododendron thicket about 2 miles south, not waving, not calling out, just standing there with one hand on a tree trunk and watching hikers go by. And I asked whether the man looked injured or needed help, and Owen said no. He looked like he'd been there a while, like he was waiting for somebody specific. And there was something about the way he said it that stuck with me, because people can usually tell the difference between being seen and being observed, and Owen clearly felt the second one. And before he left, he glanced at the note on the board and asked, almost casually, whether that was serious. And I said I didn't know yet, but I took it down and brought it inside all the same. And that night around 10, while I was filling out the weather log at the desk, I heard what sounded like a man's voice from somewhere downslope east of the station, faint at first and stretched thin by distance. But after I stepped onto the porch and listened harder, I could make out a single word repeated every 20 or 30 seconds. Help. Always the same way, same pitch, same pause afterward. And I should say here that when somebody calls for help in the backcountry, you do not ignore it. Not if you know what you're doing, because people die fast in steep country after dark. But there was something wrong with that voice almost immediately. Not supernatural, not ghostly, just wrong in the way a recording is wrong when it's played through bad speakers. Too flat, too consistent. And after the fourth call, I heard another sound under it, a slow metallic tapping from farther down the same slope, like someone lightly striking iron against stone in a patient rhythm. And that was the moment my body stopped wanting to head downhill even while my training said I should. So I tried the radio first, got only static on the handheld, then partial response from base inside the station, enough to report a possible distress call, but not enough to coordinate anything useful. And when I shouted from the porch that I was at the ranger station, and anyone needing aid should move toward the marked trail, the calling stopped instantly. No answer, no movement in the brush. Nothing but the creak in the wind moving through bare branches. And I stood there long enough to realize that whatever I was listening to had wanted me to leave the station and go down into the dark alone. And I know how paranoid that sounds, but the feeling came hard and clean. So I locked the door, kept the porch light on, and waited for daylight. And in the morning, I followed the old lower path just far enough to satisfy myself that I hadn't abandoned some injured hiker. And about 200 yards below the station, I found a fresh boot print in damp earth beside the trail. And, hanging from a dogwood branch at eye level, a small brass whistle on a snapped cord, swaying gently even though the air was still. And there were no signs of a fall, no dropped pack, no blood, no campsite, nothing, except that one print and the whistle, placed where I could not miss it, and I radioed it in with more urgency. But because there were no overdue hikers and no direct threat yet, dispatch logged it as suspicious activity and told me to stay alert until a patrol unit could work its way up from the district office, which in that terrain could mean hours or the next day depending on weather. And the thing about remote stations is that once you start noticing signs of another person close by, every ordinary sound begins to change character. So all that afternoon I kept looking up from my desk whenever acorns hit the roof or leaves scraped along the porch, and near dusk a solo female backpacker named Mara arrived from the south, looking more irritated than frightened. But when I asked whether she had seen anyone unusual, she said she had heard footsteps behind her for nearly half an hour that never got closer and never fell completely away. And every time she stepped aside to let the supposed hiker pass, the footsteps stopped too, then started again, only when she resumed walking. And once she turned suddenly and caught sight of a tan sleeve slipping behind a chestnut tree, and hearing that made me decide I did not want her camping alone in my zone. So I told her to stay at the site nearest the station, where I could at least hear if something went wrong, and she agreed without arguing, which told me she was more rattled than she wanted to admit. And just before full dark, while she was filtering water at the spring, she came back holding a folded square of paper she had found tucked beneath one strap of her pack, and on it, in the same neat block handwriting as the first note, were the words, "You shouldn't sleep so far from the cabin." And I felt something in my chest go cold, and because an unseen stranger watching the trail is one thing, but someone touching a woman's gear while she is in camp without waking her is another level entirely. And I got Mara inside the station, barred the door, and then spent the next hour trying to raise a law enforcement ranger over a radio that kept fading in and out with the weather. And sometime after 11, we both heard someone step onto the porch. One slow footfall, then another, boards creaking under deliberate weight, followed by 3 light taps on the outer wall beside the bunk window instead of the door. And I called out that the station was occupied and law enforcement had been notified. And for a few seconds nothing happened. Then a man's voice from just outside the screen said, calm as if he were asking for directions, "Which trail goes down to the old tower site?" And there was no tower site, not anymore. Just the rotted concrete footings of one that had been removed decades back. And the fact that he knew enough to ask in those terms told me he either knew the older maps or had been listening to locals talk. And before I could answer, from somewhere just off the porch in the dark came that same slow metal on stone tapping, 3 careful strikes, and then the footsteps moved away across the leaves toward the lower trace. Not hurried, not crashing through brush, just a person leaving because he had made his point. And neither Mara nor I slept much after that. And at dawn, I found a fresh boot print beneath the bunk window, along with a strip of orange survey tape tied low to a sapling where it could not be seen from the trail. And by mid-morning, 2 more hikers came in from the west, a father and teenage son, both pale enough that I knew before they opened their mouths what had happened, because the father said they had heard a man below the lower path shouting that he had a broken leg and needed someone to come help him. But the son interrupted to say the voice repeated exactly every time. Same words, same pause. And while they were listening, they heard somebody else moving uphill behind him in the brush. And that settled it for me. Because now the pattern was too clear to ignore. A voice used as bait from one direction while an actual person watched from another, trying to draw people off the marked trail and separate them. And just after noon, before any patrol had arrived, the base radio on my desk crackled to life with a burst of static, and a man's voice said, "Take the lower trace and keep going until the rocks open up." And all four of us in that cabin went still, because it wasn't dispatch. It wasn't another ranger. It was the same calm voice from the woods, close enough to hit my frequency clearly, and under his breathing came that familiar metallic tapping, as if he were idly striding some tool against stone while he talked. Then he added, "If you want to find a camp, come alone." And the transmission cut out before I could answer, and the teenage boy whispered, "He's right outside," which was probably not literally true, but felt true in the moment, because a man does not get on a ranger frequency in those mountains unless he is close or knows the terrain well enough to make the signal work. And about 15 minutes later, Mara, who was standing by the west window, sucked in a breath and pointed, and I saw him then for the first and only clear time. Standing maybe 60 yards away, among the hemlocks, tall and lean in a tan jacket and dark knit cap, one shoulder turned toward us, holding something narrow and metallic down by his leg that caught a little gray light, maybe a pry bar, maybe a tool handle. And he wasn't hiding, not really, just watching the station with the kind of stillness that makes a person look practiced. And when I moved toward the door, he lifted his frise hand once and pointed downhill toward the lower trace, then stepped behind a tree and vanished so completely it was like the mountain folded over him. And I would have gone after him in a different job years earlier, when I was dumber and more convinced that confidence could substitute for backup. But by then, I understood I was dealing with somebody patient enough to stage encounters and comfortable enough in that terrain to disappear at will. So I kept everybody inside until, near dusk, a county deputy and one law enforcement ranger finally hiked in from the west, and together we checked the lower trace, where a quarter-mile downslope we found a hidden camp under deadfall that had been arranged to avoid detection from above. With a low tarp, stacked food tins, cigarette butts pinched flat at the filter, and several strips of orange tape tucked beneath a rock along with one of the station's missing brass thumbtacks. But no person, no obvious stolen packs, no body, and no sign of where he had gone, except for one set of deep boot tracks leading into a laurel thicket and then disappearing on stone. And officially, it became a report of suspicious activity involving an unknown male subject targeting hikers near an unmaintained trail, which sounds much cleaner than the reality of it. And they transferred me out 2 days later to a busier post because nobody wanted a single ranger isolated there after that. But the part that still bothers me happened the morning I left, when I reached the locked service gate 5 miles away where my truck had been parked since the start of the assignment, and found my station key hanging from the driver's side mirror on a loop of orange tape, even though that key had been in my pocket the entire drive down. And tied to it was a folded piece of paper with one final line in that same meat block handwriting. Simple enough that I still remember the exact spacing of the letters. "Good thing you stayed inside." By the time I took the winter ranger posting in a remote section of the Appalachian high country, I already knew that isolation in the mountains could make ordinary things feel loaded with meaning. But I also thought I had enough experience to separate nerves from actual danger, and that confidence was probably the first mistake I made, because the station they sent me to sat farther off the usual backcountry routes than any place I had worked before. A narrow Forest Service cabin built above a drainage near the North Carolina-Virginia corridor where an old fire road ended and the foot trails took over. And during the colder months, hardly anyone came through, besides a handful of long-distance hikers, the occasional local hunter on legal access routes, and the rare search team or maintenance worker passing through on official business. So most days it was just me, the stove, the radio, a ring of black trees around the clearing, and wind moving over the ridges, with a sound that could make the whole station seem like it was breathing in its sleep. And for the first week, that was manageable, almost peaceful, because routine has a way of taming remoteness if nothing interrupts it. But what unsettled me from the start was how often I found signs that someone had been very close to the station without ever approaching it in a normal way. Little things at first, too small to make a formal report, sound reasonable, like the porch gate unlatched at dawn after I knew I had latched it the night before, a boot scrape in the frost under the bunk window that melted before I could photograph it properly. And once, a strip of dark cloth snagged on the outer wire fence where there should not have been any fabric at all, because no marked trail passed that side of the clearing. And maybe any one of those details alone could have been dismissed. But remote work teaches you to respect accumulation, because danger in the woods often arrives as a pattern before it becomes an event. And the pattern sharpened one evening in early December when I heard a voice come through the base radio, just after 8, during the part of the night when the battery lanterns throw a warmer light than the overhead bulb, and every corner of the base cabin feels a little farther away than it does in daylight. And at first, I thought it was another ranger from a neighboring district, because the tone was calm, almost bored. But then I realized I didn't recognize the call sign. And the man wasn't asking for weather or road conditions. He was giving directions in a steady, conversational voice, saying, "Stay on the lower path until you reach the split stump. Then cut left where the stones start." And that by itself was strange, because none of those landmarks meant anything on any current map I knew. And while I sat there listening, waiting for him to move, identify himself, or realize he was on the wrong frequency, I heard another sound beneath his breathing, faint but distinct. Somebody striking metal against rock, with a slow patience that made the rhythm feel intentional rather than accidental. One tap every few seconds, and I keyed the mic and told him he was transmitting on a Forest Service channel and needed to identify himself. But the voice kept going, as if he either hadn't heard me or didn't care. "If you pass the old wire, you've gone too far," he said. And then there was a pause long enough that I almost thought he was finished. But in that silence, the metallic tapping continued in the background. Closer somehow, or maybe just clearer, because he wasn't talking over it. And then he added, "She'll be waiting where the creek narrows," before the transmission cut to static. And I sat there for several seconds with my hand still on the radio, because even after years of hearing odd traffic, that one had a quality I immediately disliked. Not because it sounded supernatural or theatrical, but because it sounded practical. Like a man describing a route he knew well. And the phrasing stuck with me, because nobody with legitimate business in that sector would have used landmarks that old unless they had been operating off abandoned maps, local memory, or their own private system of movement through the woods. And when I checked the trail log and district notes, there was no authorized team in my zone, no overdue hiker, no search in progress, and no woman expected through that route that night. So I wrote it down, tried raising dispatch, got only partial signal because weather was moving in, and went to bed telling myself I had overheard some local using a scavenged radio from farther down the mountain, but not sleeping well, because there is a big difference between random interference in a voice that sounds like it knows exactly where it is. And the next morning I found a set of tracks in the wet edge of the clearing, near the east side of the station where no one should have been walking. One clear boot print, and one shallower impression as though the other sole had worn smooth. And both were angled toward the cabin wall beneath the radio room window. And that was enough to make me circle the building with a flashlight even though the sun was already up. Which is the sort of thing you do not like to catch yourself doing, because it means your body has started operating ahead of your pride. And later that afternoon, with low cloud pushing across the ridge and the first sleet of the season ticking softly on the roof, a couple in their 50s came through on the main trail asking whether there was another station south of mine, because they had heard a woman calling for help below an unmarked side path about a mile back. And when they stopped to listen, a man somewhere farther uphill had called out, "This way," in a perfectly calm voice, not shouting, just directing them. And the husband admitted He had almost stepped off trail before his wife pointed out the obvious problem. I see him both hell, which was that no injured person would have one calm guide voice answering from one direction while the supposed distress call came from another. And hearing that made the back of my neck tighten, because it echoed the radio transmission too closely to be chance. Directions to a place that was not supposed to exist. Some vague she waiting near water. And that same effort to draw people away from marked routes into folds of terrain where visibility collapsed to almost nothing. So I filed a more serious incident report, requested law enforcement patrol, and got the usual answer about distance, weather, and limited staffing, which in plain English meant I was on my own for the night unless something overtly violent happened first. And what I hated most about that answer was that it left me in the exact psychological spot these situations exploit, knowing enough to be uneasy but not enough to trigger the kind of response that makes you feel protected. And that night the mountain went quiet, in a way I have only heard a few times in my life. No wind in the branches, no creek noise carrying up from below. Just a heavy winter stillness that made even the hiss of the propane heater sound intrusive. And around 10:30 the radio clicked again, without a proper hail tone, and the same voice came through, closer and clearer than before, saying, "You're writing this down, aren't you?" And for a second I genuinely did not move because the sentence landed with the intimate wrongness of a stranger using your first name. Then I grabbed the mic and demanded identification, and the man gave a short laugh under his breath. Not amused exactly, more like satisfied. And in the background I heard those slow metallic strikes again, along with something else this time, the faint scrape of brush being moved aside. And then he said, "Don't send her by the old grade tomorrow," and cut out. And I want to be very clear that there was no her to send, not that I knew of. But the next morning, just after first light, a solo backpacker named Tessa came to the station asking about water sources and overnight shelter options because sleet had turned to freezing rain and she was reconsidering her mileage plan. And she fit the category of person that voice had implied too neatly for me to ignore. Experienced enough to be alone, not local, moving southbound through a low-traffic section. So I asked whether anyone had bothered her on trail, and she hesitated before saying she had seen a man in a dark cap standing above a cut bank about half a mile back, where the trail bent along a laurel tunnel. And when she looked at him directly, he stepped behind a hemlock and vanished without making a sound. And then, a little later, she found a strip of orange tape tied to one of the blazes at knee height, with an arrow drawn on it in black marker, pointing off trail toward the drainage. And because she was not an idiot, she had kept walking until she saw my station. And I still remember the anger I felt then. Not dramatic anger, just the hard, cold kind that comes when fear stops being abstract and becomes a pattern aimed at actual people. Because it was one thing to pace my clearing and use my radio, but another to start selecting travelers and shaping their movement through a section of wilderness where 100 yards of bad decision can hide you from help completely. So I told Tessa she was staying near the station until patrol arrived, or weather broke, and she agreed faster than I expected, which meant she was more spooked than her tone suggested. And through the afternoon I kept us busy with practical tasks, because practical movement helps keep panic from filling all available space. Checking batteries, updating logs, heating water on the stove. And each time I stepped onto the porch, I scanned a tree line until it made my eyes ache. Because by then I had accepted that whoever was doing this knew the terrain around that station better than I did. Probably knew the dead zones in the old grades and the places where a person could stand 20 yards away without being seen from the windows. And sometime, while freezing rain tapped against the porch mesh, and the clearing had that gray, underwater look bad weather gives the woods, I found a folded note tucked inside the mail permit box outside. And I know it had not been there 10 minutes earlier, because I had checked the box myself, and written in neat square block letters were the words, "The lower camp is warmer than the cabin." And I did not show it to Tessa right away, because I did not want to escalate her fear before I had a plan. But the fact that someone had crossed my clearing in daylight, approached the permit box, and retreated without either of us hearing more than weather on the roof, changed the whole feeling of the place for me. Because now, I wasn't just watching the woods. I was understanding that the woods had enough cover for a man to watch us while moving whenever the rain masked him. And around dusk, 2 volunteer trail workers came in from the north, both wet and tired, and both carrying the same strange report that they had seen a red light blinking intermittently through the trees below the old railroad grade, too high and steady to be a trail marker and too controlled to be random equipment. And when they tried to angle toward it, the light disappeared and reappeared farther away, as if somebody were walking just beyond sightline and making sure not to be caught. And I almost told them. None of that surprised me anymore, but instead, I got all of them inside, latched the porch, and tried again to raise district with enough urgency that they finally confirmed a law enforcement ranger was hiking in from the west with county backup behind him. Though given the weather, we were looking at several more hours. And in isolation, several more hours can feel like a moral insult because it means your only strategy is to endure. And that night, with 4 of us in the cabin and the windows gone black with rain and cold, the whole station still felt exposed. Maybe more exposed, because shared fear can thicken the air in a room if everyone is trying not to infect everyone else with it. And just after 9, the base radio snapped alive so loudly one of the volunteers cursed, and the same man's voice said, Take the old grade until the wire fence drops away, then wait by the creek." And before I could answer, another voice came over the same channel. This one a woman's voice, distant and ragged, and saying, "Please, I can't," before cutting off mid-sentence. And one of the volunteers actually took a step toward the door before I grabbed his arm, because that is how effective a human distress sound can be, even when every part of your mind knows you are being manipulated. And then the male voice returned, calm as ever, saying, "She's cold." While that slow metal on stone tapping continued underneath, and I transmitted immediately, repeating our call sign and requesting emergency assistance. And this time I got enough broken acknowledgement through the static to know dispatch had heard at least part of it. But hearing and arriving are very different things. And for the next 20 minutes we sat with every lantern on and every flashlight ready, while the rain eased into sleet, and the soundscape outside changed from soft patter to the occasional hard tick of ice hitting the porch rails. And then we heard footsteps circling the station, not rushing, not stomping, just one person walking a measured loop through wet leaves and frozen mud, passing beneath the radio window, pausing under the bunk wall, continuing around the porch. And every time the steps moved out of hearing, I felt my body preparing for glass to break or the latch to jerk. But instead he kept circling as if memorizing the structure by feel. And once, while the footsteps were under the west wall, the radio clicked, and the man's voice said, "You should have let her come down," which did more to shake me than any shouted threat could have, because it confirmed two things at once: that he was nearby enough to time his transmission with his movement around the cabin, and that he had been observing us long enough to know Tessa was inside. And when the footsteps stopped, all of us in that room stopped breathing for a second, waiting for impact that never came. And after maybe half a minute, there was a quiet metallic scrape beneath the bunk window, like a blade or a screwdriver drawn once along the siding, and then nothing at all, just weather and our own strained listening. And at some point after midnight, when fear had become a physical ache between my shoulders, county units finally reached the clearing with a law enforcement ranger and 2 deputies, all of them wet, cold, and angry in the practical way officers get when they know a suspect has been toying with both civilians and response times. And what followed was the kind of search that looks forceful in flashlight beams but feels heartbreakingly thin against a mountain at night, because they swept the immediate perimeter, tracked a partial boot pattern downslope to the old railroad grade, found several fresh orange tape markers tied low on brush to indicate a route toward the creek, and a quarter-mile below the station located a concealed camp built into a rock shelf under Laurel, where a tarp had been stretched so tightly and so low that you could pass within 20 feet in daylight and never notice it. And inside, they found candle stubs, food tins, a stolen Forest Service battery charger from another district, a handheld radio programmed to our frequency, and a little stack of folded notes written in the same block hand, but no occupant, because whoever had been there knew enough to leave before the search line locked in. And down by the creek, where the old wire fence had collapsed, they also found a narrow space between boulders containing a woman's knit cap, 2 snapped chemical hand warmers, and a section of cord tied to a root. And no, they never proved whether those items belonged to a missing hiker, a stage setup, or some older unrelated event, and that uncertainty was part of what made the whole thing rot in my head afterward, because the official line became attempted enticement, unlawful entry, radio interference, criminal trespass on federal land, all technically true, and all much too tidy for the actual experience of spending a night in a cabin while a stranger walked circles around it and used your own radio channel to tell you what you should have done. And I was transferred out the next week after giving statements and turning over logs. But the part I still think about happened months later, when one of the deputies who had been on the search called me privately and said they had traced a stolen Charger to a ranger station burglary from 2 years earlier in another Appalachian district. One connected to an unsolved incident involving a volunteer searcher who said a calm male voice on a handheld had directed her toward the lower camp by the creek before she was found hypothermic and disoriented, miles off route, with no memory of how she got there. And he told me that because he thought I deserved to know, there had probably been a pattern long before my assignment. But what stayed with me most was the last thing he added, almost as an afterthought, which was that when they processed the concealed tamp below my station, they found one page torn from my current duty log, folded carefully inside a tin, and on the back, in that same block lettering, were 4 words that still bother me more than any direct threat ever could. You write everything down. I took the last Appalachian Ranger Station assignment of my career in early November, and by then I was old enough in the job to know that the most dangerous situations in remote country rarely begin with anything dramatic, because almost nothing in the wilderness annexes itself properly at first. It just leans slightly out of place and waits to see whether you notice. And the station they sent me to sat in a narrow fold of national forest near the Kentucky-Virginia border, where the mountains felt less scenic than secretive. All steep timber, old mining scars, abandoned grades disappearing into brush, and long damp hollows where daylight seemed to drain away earlier than it should. And the cabin itself was as isolated as anything I had ever worked out of. A 1-room ranger station with a radio alcove, a bunk, a propane heater, a screened porch, and a supply shed, positioned above a little junction where the marked foot trail crossed an older unofficial path locals still used when they thought nobody was looking. And the official reason they staffed it that late in the year was because there had been repeated reports of vandalism, trespassing, and suspicious contact with backpackers moving through the area. Nothing severe enough in isolation to justify a full law enforcement presence, but enough to keep a ranger on site for visibility. And I accepted the posting because I was nearing the end of my fieldwork anyway and thought one more quiet mountain assignment would be manageable. But the first thing that bothered me was how the station log from the previous ranger had been left, not messy or unfinished, but paused, with the final entry cut off mid-sentence after the words, "checked lower trail marker," and no explanation on the next page. And when I asked District about it, they said he had been reassigned early after a family issue came up, which might have been true, but the sort of people who keep orderly logs do not usually abandon a sentence halfway through unless something breaks their attention hard. And that detail stayed with me even after I unpacked and settled into routine. Because routine is what makes remote postings livable. Sweeping the porch in the morning, checking the spring line, updating trail conditions, radioing district at sin hours, and listening to the mountains until their sounds sort themselves into categories your body can relax around. Wind in oak leaves, distant creek noise, crows, deer moving through brush, old trees shifting at night. But by the third evening, I started hearing something I could not classify into any harmless category. Footsteps on the lower unofficial path, after dark. Not every hour. Not circling close enough to count as direct harassment. just one person passing at irregular times below the station where the ground dropped toward the drainage, always too far to see clearly from the porch but close enough that I could hear leaves compress under boots, and once the little clink of metal brushing metal, like a tool striking a belt buckle. And twice I stepped outside with a flashlight and called that the ranger station was occupied and assistance was available if needed, and both times the footsteps stopped until I went back in, then resumed a minute later, moving farther downslope. And because the area had a history of locals using old routes for hunting access and dumping, I told myself that was probably all it was, some trespasser making use of the unofficial trail and waiting me out because he did not want contact. But the unease deepened the next afternoon when a backpacker named Allison came to the station shivering in light rain and asked whether I had seen a man in a dark coat carrying a red headlamp. And when I said no, she told me that for the last 2 miles, she had repeatedly seen that red light blink through the trees off her left side, sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind. And once when she stopped moving, the light held steady in one place while she heard someone walking parallel through the brush. And what unsettled her most was that the person never tried to approach or hide completely, just kept pace, as if making sure she knew she wasn't alone. And she laughed while telling me this in the brittle way people do when they want a thing to sound smaller than it felt. But her hands were shaking while she tightened a cap on her water bottle. And I asked where she planned to camp, and then quietly told her I wanted her to use the site closest to the station, rather than continue another 5 miles to the next shelter. And she agreed with no argument at all, which told me enough. And that night the rain turned colder, and the forest had that soaked black look Appalachian woods get after dark, where every trunk seems farther away than it is. And around 10:30, while I was at the desk entering a trail report, the base radio crackled with a burst of static, and a man's voice came through in a low, even tone saying, "Keep following the old cut until you find the wire, and then turn toward the creek." And for one stupid second, I thought I had clipped into somebody else's channel. But then I realized he was not identifying himself or asking for confirmation. He was simply giving directions, calm as if speaking to someone right beside him. And under his breathing was a faint, repeated sound that made my stomach tighten before I understood why. A slow, rhythmic tapping of metal on rock. Patient and controlled, one strike every few seconds. And I keyed the mic and told him this was a Forest Service frequency, and he needed to identify himself immediately. But he went on in the same tone. "If she reaches the stones, tell her not to call out," and then the transmission died. And because Allison was the only woman in my zone that night, those words landed with an immediacy I can still feel when I think about it. And I went straight to the porch, called her name toward the nearby campsite, and got an answer right away. Thank God. But when I asked whether anyone had come near her site, she said no, though she had heard footsteps downslope that stopped whenever she unzipped her tent. And I brought her into the station on the spot, no debate, and told District I had possible radio interference and a suspicious person in the area. But weather and terrain made the response the same weak promise I had heard too many times in remote work. Document, remain inside, patrol when available. And what I hated most was how professionally those words can be delivered while still leaving you essentially alone with the problem. And sometime after midnight we heard 3 knocks on the outside wall beneath the bunk window. Slow and deliberate, not on the door where any sane person seeking help would knock. And Allison looked at me in a way I still remember, because it was the look of someone realizing another human being has chosen to be frightening on purpose. And I called out that law enforcement had been notified, though that was mostly bluff. And after a pause, a man's voice from outside the wall said, conversationally, "You should have let her keep walking." And I don't mind admitting that hearing speech through a thin wooden wall in the middle of a mountain night changed the whole event from unsettling to genuinely dangerous in my mind. Because there is a point at which a watcher becomes an intruder even if he never forces entry. And for the next minute, we heard him moving along the side of the cabin with careful steps through wet leaves. Then the faint scrape of something hard dragged once across the siding, then silence. And when dawn came, I found a set of mismatched tracks in the mud beneath the window, one deep lug boot and one smoother worn sole, plus a little pile of objects arranged neatly on the ground. as if set there for me to notice, a red plastic lens cover from a headlamp, 2 cigarette butts pinched flat at the filter, and a laminated trail map with one unofficial route circled in pencil leading to an old mine cut east of the station. And because deliberate placement is its own kind of message, I radioed that in with more urgency than before, and by mid-morning, a volunteer maintenance pair arrived from the west with a report that tightened everything further, saying they had heard a woman shouting from below the unofficial lower path near the old cut. But each call sounded identical, same words, same spacing, and while they stood listening, they saw a man in a dark coat farther uphill between the trees, watching them with a red light clipped to his chest strap. And once he realized they had spotted him, he simply stepped behind a trunk and disappeared. No rush, no panic. And by then I knew the pattern too well to pretend otherwise. One voice drawing people away, one real person controlling the approach, and probably old rope knowledge, allowing him to move around marked trails better than the visitors he targeted. And I should say none of this felt supernatural in person. Not for a second, because that would almost have been easier. This felt methodical, like dealing with a patient human being who had learned how fear works in remote places and enjoyed using terrain to produce it. And that afternoon, District Friendly sent a law enforcement ranger hiking in with county backup behind him. But because mountain timing is what it is, they would not reach us until near dark, and for those remaining hours every sound became a test. Every creak of the porch, every raving call, every tick from the cooling stove making Allison flinch and making me fight not to mirror her. And around 4 the radio clicked alive again, and the same voice said, "The camp is still there if you want to see what she left." And beneath his breathing came that metal tapping once more, closer and clearer, and I transmitted immediately, repeating our call sign in emergency status. And, this time before the signal shredded, I heard District say units were within a mile, which should have comforted me but didn't, because a mile in those woods can hold an entire nightmare. And about 10 minutes later, Allison, who had been sitting nearest the west window, suddenly stood and whispered, "There." And I saw him for the first and only clear time, maybe 50 yards away among bare trees on the edge of the lower path. Tall, thin, dark coat, red lamp hanging dead at his chest, one arm down by his side holding something metallic that caught the weak afternoon light, maybe a hammer, maybe a pry bar. And what unnerved me most was that he was not trying to approach the cabin or flee from it. He was standing still, like a man waiting for a bus, comfortable, almost casual. As if he had spent enough time around that station to feel entitled to be seen there. And then he raised one hand and pointed downhill toward the old mine cut, before stepping behind a stand of young poplar and vanishing so completely that for a moment I wondered if I had misjudged the distance and he had dropped into a gully. But no, he was just gone. And when law enforcement finally arrived at dusk, we moved fast, because daylight was almost out and none of us wanted to give him another full night in that terrain. So we searched the unofficial trail in the cut east of the station, and less than half a mile down, we found a hidden camp built under a collapsed section of old mining debris, where it would not be visible from above, with a tarp, stacked food cans, dead batteries, orange survey tape, and a stolen handheld radio programmed to Forest Service frequency, along with a shallow storage niche in the dirt holding maps, notepaper, and a small collection of items that made the whole thing turn colder in my chest. Permit stubs, trail snack wrappers, one child's glove, 2 cracked phones, and a notebook page listing dates and partial descriptions of hikers who had passed through that sector over the previous month. And among those entries was Allison's tent color and my truck model, which meant he had not just been haunting the area generally, he had been cataloging people, learning routines, choosing moments. And although the officers pushed farther into the cut until full dark, they never found him. Only fresher tracks leading over stone and disappearing into the old drainage. And officially it became a criminal trespass case, with evidence of stalking and unlawful radio interference, which was accurate but nowhere near sufficient, because no report language captures the reality of seeing your own movements written down in a stranger's hand deep in the mountains. And I left that station 2 days later, After statements and inventory, telling myself the search would eventually catch up to him, because men who build systems around other people's fear usually grow bold enough to make mistakes. But the part that has stayed with me for years was what happened after I got home. When District mailed back the personal items I had left in the cabin, including my spare field notebook, and tucked inside it was a page that did not belong to me, folded once, bearing the same neat block handwriting found at the hidden camp. And on it were 7 words that still hit harder than any threat. You heard him before you saw me.